Okay, this is review for the midterm for IS 520 MBA 614. So I guess the way I want to handle this really is, first of all, if anyone has kind of any specific questions that they want to address, we'll handle those first. And then other than that, we can just kind of work our way through the study guide and see how far we get. Question here?
Yeah, I have a question about the deep familiar with functions. It would be like trim, left, right. Do we have to know like the exact parameters we have to get in their order?
Okay, so let me read the question for the video. So we look at chapter 9, 7, oops, 9. Oh yeah, so I specifically tell you this, be familiar with the trim function. So yeah, I expect you to know how to use that function, that if you see it in code, you go, I understand what that's doing. So let's, and these, yeah, there's not really that much here. Let's just go through them real quick, shall we? Yeah, I'm expecting you to be able to look at code that uses them and be able to say, I know what that's returning. Let me just go ahead and open up Excel here. And oh, we got the founding quotes going on. I guess we can work in this. My immediate window, let's just make the immediate window the main window of the day. Okay, so I'm expecting that if you see something that looks like this, trim, and then you see some spaces in here, you'd be able to look at that and say, I know what that's going to return. So what is trim going to do? So it's going to
remove all the spaces on the outside of the
right. Leading and trailing spaces is a lot. I'm not really. This might seem strange to you, but I'm not really all that great with Excel. So I understand there's a function in Excel called trim that will actually take out spaces from the middle of the string too, like condenses. But the trim in VBA is just leading and trailing spaces. So all this space in the middle is going to stay when we print it. But you can see that the first one counts. You really can't see that the last one's off there, but if I try to click out here, there's no spaces out here for me to click on. So yeah. So if you think of something like left, it's good enough for you to know that we've got a string and we've got a number. You don't have to know the order of that because you're gonna look at code and you're gonna say, oh, there's the string, there's the number, and the code that I'm gonna give you is gonna be working code. The very first time I gave a midterm exam in this class, every question had at the end, none of the above, because this code cannot execute as written. And the class was ready to hang me for that. And in truth, I realized that's beyond what I should have expected them to be able to know. So that's gone. So there may be a couple of questions where the code can't execute, but it's going to be something that's really specific. It's not there at the end of every one. So there's going to be a couple of things where I'm expecting you to look at that and go, oh yeah, that's just not valid. But it's not looming over you with every question. Okay, so do you have any other questions there on the left, right, mid, replace, U case, L case? Okay, other questions? Well, if you think of other questions, don't feel bad to chime up. But in the meantime, let's just kind of go through. Okay, so I've given you kind of two sample questions, and that's just so you can see what most of the test is made up of. So there's a few questions like this, where I give you some line of code, and what is font here? So we look at font. So is it an object? Is it a property, a method, event? Is it a collection? Oh, both an object and a property. Oh boy, property and a method, object and a method. What do you think? So looking at font. Don't feel bad about like getting this partially right or even getting it wrong. I just said, what is font? Kind of in the lingo of what we've talked about here. What is it? Go ahead. Okay, good. So let me just repeat for the video. So what you said is, hey, we got, this definitely is referring, this is identifying an object. Now, whether this thing is a reference to an object or a reference to a method or a property, I'm not really that concerned about, but this identifies an object. And so object dot, when you see object dot, you know the thing that comes after it is either a property or it's a method. Got to be either a property or a method. Good. So because it comes after a dot, you go boom, property or method. Now, so what else? So good. So property is right, but is that all that it is? So that gets us down to either B, F, or G. Any other thoughts? Again, go ahead. Aha, very good. So you said, listen, I've got a dot. This is coming after a dot, so it's got to be property or method. But then I'm seeing it's got a dot after it, and that means it's got to identify an object. And so you're saying, hey, this is a property and it's an object. And that's true. Technically, it's possible for a method to execute and return a reference to an object. And so I would also give full credit here to both an object and a method, because it's kind of beyond what I would expect you to be able to identify the difference between an object and between a method and a property in this particular context. So you look at that and say it's coming after a dot, so it's got to be either property or a method, and it's got a dot after it, so that's got to identify an object. So it's object and property or object and method. It turns out font's a property, so that's the real answer, but being able to tell it's a property versus a method is more than I would expect you to do. Go ahead.
So what is the difference between a property and a method? Or I guess if we don't need to know that, then that's fine. But...
Yeah, there are some things I do expect you to understand the difference between a property and a method. So the big difference between a property and a method is that a method itself is an instruction. And so a call to a method can be a whole statement all by itself. Whereas a call to a property can't live by itself as a whole VBA statement. Let me show you what I mean. So if I come over here and I refer to an object, so I say active sheet, or I'll say a particular range B5 dot select. Whoops, let me get rid of the question mark here. So I'm just, so first of all, what do you think? What do you think select is? Object, or do you think it's a property? I'm sorry, method or property? Yeah, it's a method. Now tell me why you think it's a method. Have you just memorized it? Or is there something else going on? Go ahead.
Well, I think based on what I've seen, it seems like property is like an adjective and a method.
Okay, so the comment is property is like an adjective and a method's like a verb. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. Objects are like nouns. So you got nouns, adjectives, and verbs. That's pretty good because properties describe the way objects are, and methods are telling me something about something that an object knows how to do, so it's an action. Trouble is, sometimes a word like, can I think of any? There's some that are like both a noun and a verb, same word. Order, for instance, is both a noun and a verb. And so you can't just rely on the part of speech that is to know for sure. But in this case, if I look at this and I say, wow, that is a statement that's just by itself, and I can execute that line of code, that has to be a method, because a method is an instruction. I'm telling the computer to do something. Do this method that you know how to do. It's an instruction to do something. Whereas a property by itself, like address, address is a noun and a verb, right? You can address something, or it can be addressed. So in this case, so what's the address of range B5? It's B5. That's what it is. But now, if I try to execute that as a line, it's like telling the interpreter B5. And it's not enough. It doesn't know what to do. I could tell it select B5. I could say take range B5 and make its interior blue or something. But just B5 by itself is not enough. So I am expecting you to look at the code in some context and say, oh, I can look at that line right there. That's got to be a, well, if it says, something like debug.print. say, you know what, that's property because we're just printing out a value. But if it's on line by itself, b5.select, and you look at that and go, wow, that's a executable line, has to be a method. Got it? I'm not going to come up with like obscure methods that you've never heard of. I expect you to know that it's a method, which is kind of what it feels like right here. You got to look at it and tell what it is. And there'll be stuff that we've worked with in class before and be able to look at it and go, okay. Yeah, I can see it in this context. It's one we've seen before. We're okay. Okay, so that is, one kind of question, normal multiple choice kind of question. Here's, some kind of question, some choices. Give me the right one. Go ahead.
Obviously here, properties can be objects.
So property?
Or objects can be properties, right?
Objects can be properties. That's correct.
Can objects also be methods?
Can an object also be a method? And the answer is, a method can return a reference to an object. And so when you look at it, you can say, in fact, that's really what's going on here. This to me feels a lot like a method, right? It's range something. I've got some sheet, some object here, dot. So I got to say it's either property or a method. I'm passing it a parameter. I'm telling it, do your range thing, and I'm telling it A1 to look on. I think technically Microsoft calls this a property, but the point is, whether it's a property or whether it's a method, it's returning a reference to an object. It's, some code is running and saying, this is the object we're talking about. That's the one. Right. Oh, go ahead. You're starting. So bold. Okay, so let's take a look at bold. So tell me, what do you think? So why are you saying it's a property? All right, we're assigning a value into it. Now that's something we never do with just a method. You never say, here's some method, and this method equals something. Methods just don't do that. Methods can run and return references to objects, but we don't ever set that the method equal to something else. So yeah, but that's the main thing for properties, right? Property is just, it's holding a value that describes the way the object is. Other questions here? Go ahead. So is bold also an object? And the answer is no. So because bold is just holding a value, it's a property. Now, we talked about variables, right? We talked about these variables like Boolean type of variables and single and double and string. A variable just holds a value. It's a really simple structure. It's just holding a value. And that's really what a property is. A property is a variable that's built into an object. So I've got to define this object, this kind of complex thing, and I've got some variables that are built into this object. Those are properties. And so if it's ever just holding a single value, not if it's not, it could hold a reference to another object. But if it's, I remember just assigning a simple value to it, you go, that's got to be a property. There's a question here.
So when you're talking about range, property, object, method, if we're asked this question, what would range be?
Yeah, so your best answer here is to say, yeah, that's it's definitely identifying an object. Yeah, it's also a property too. I'm not going to do that to you. Yeah, you're not going to have to go get that specific. Yeah. So what I am interested is that you can kind of look at code and go, I've got some feeling for the difference between a method and an object, method, property. That's what I'm after. And I'm not going to. I will not do that to you, right there. That's complex. In fact, there's maybe about half of the faculty in my department teach VBA in the context of IS 201, the intro class. It's like 5 days of VBA. I would expect most of the faculty not to be able to get that answer right, to look at that and go, oh, that's really a property, or that's really a method. They would look at that and go, it's an object. That's okay. Okay, second kind of problem you're going to have are ones that look like this. Consider the following code segment. Here is sub-procedure proc1. Oh, and by the way, I've given you some instructions on the exam. So anytime you see a question like this, it's like in a block. When you get to this section of this section of the test, there's a block that says when you look at that question, you can just assume that is the only code in the whole project. You're seeing the whole module in its entirety. You don't have to assume there's some other code happening somewhere else. So we've got a sub procedure here. So we got sub and sub. That looks great. Yeah, we're declaring a variable, we're setting it to a value, we're putting something into A1. Great. Okay, so let's just follow through this code. So I'm asking you, rather than asking you to write code out, which is a nightmare to take a grade, I'm asking you, can you look at this code and follow it and understand what it does? So just someone tell me, what does this statement do? Say it in English. Yeah, this is the test. This string of characters is being put into the value property of the object of the cell A1, range A1. Good. Okay, so now we've got an if, else, and if. So what I'm really asking in this question is, do you understand how the if statement works? Kind of in all of its glory. So if x equals 5, so here's the first thing we do. We check that, and we got to ask ourselves, is that true or false? When this line of code runs, is that expression true or false? True. So what does that mean? We come into the block that's right below it. We're going to change what's in the value property of A1. It's going to be what it currently is, which is, this test is, and I'm going to concatenate on a space and ugly. So what's going to be, at this point, what's in there? This test is ugly. Now I'm going to change x to be what it used to be, which was what? 5. I'm add 5 onto it. So now x is 10. Okay. So now I get to the else if, and I ask myself, now does x equal 10? X equals 10. True or false? Yeah. Say it louder. It's true, but it doesn't matter, right? Because as soon as I execute one of these blocks, I don't even look at the rest of the conditions. And so even though this will evaluate to true, and by the time we get here, this will be true, doesn't matter. We never execute this. So really the question I'm asking here, by asking, can you read this code, is do you get that these different blocks are mutually exclusive? That as soon as one runs, no other one is going to run. You know, even though, would it be possible that I could have several else ifs and all of the conditions are true? It's totally possible, in which case the first one executes and the rest we don't even evaluate. And so we would drop to the end if, and then we're to the end sub, and so we're done. So here's the question. After proc1 runs, the value shown in A range A1 of the currently active worksheet will be, see, this test is ugly. By the way, those are both kind of former questions from prior versions of the exam. I change the exam a little bit every time. When I get a really good question that has good discrimination, I tend to keep it around, but others kind of come in and out. Go ahead. What question? We're talking about question 2? Yep. Right here, yeah. Well, the question is, how come there's no method here? And the answer is, a method is something that an object knows how to do. I am telling that object to do something that it knows about. In this case, I'm not trying to tell it to do anything. I'm just trying to change one of the characteristics of the object. I'm trying to change the value of that cell. That's all I'm trying to accomplish. I'm not trying to select it. I'm not trying to, really not a whole lot of methods that I know about for ranges. Interestingly enough, putting a comment onto a range, like put a comment onto a cell, that's actually a method that generates that. It's not a property. You put a method that does that. So add comment is a method. I'm not trying to do any of those things. I'm just trying to change a property. So it doesn't have to be a method when I'm referring to it, but there could be. Okay, for those of you who have just joined us, what we're doing is we're just, there are a couple of questions that we answered straight off. We're just going through the study guide because I don't know what else to do. But if you have a question, you bring it up. I'm glad to go in that direction. Go ahead.
I have a question about collections. So I have 2 questions about collections. You have a question in the study guide that says understand what the delete method does in a collection of worksheets or shapes. And I know what the add method does, and it talks about that in my educator section, but it didn't talk about the delete method. Is that just when you're deleting a certain worksheet out of the collection of worksheets?
Yeah. Okay. Let's just take a look. So the question is, you're expecting us to understand this delete method for a collection. So first, let's just go ahead and talk a little bit about collections, and then we'll take a look at that specifically. So there are several built-in collections in an Excel workbook. right? There's a workbooks collection. What's the workbooks collection? It's a collection to all currently open workbooks. Each workbook has a worksheets collection, which is a collection of all the currently open worksheets. So one of the things we do with it, and I'll do that worksheets.add. And so if I execute the add method, and this is kind of true of virtually every collection. Virtually every collection has an add method. So workbooks, I think, has an open method. You can't just, well, I guess you can create a new workbook. So I think the workbooks method has an add as well. So, but what does it do? It just makes a new element of that collection. So this collection has stuff in it, we're making a new one. And so if we look down here, I've got 3 tabs open here, 3 sheets. I execute that, and that is going to, it's going to add a new sheet. So now, what about the delete? Oh, what did I say? The delete method of a collection. I'm not sure my wording was really specific as to what I was after there. What I really want is that you be able to understand that you can delete objects out of a collection. So if there really is a delete method of a collection, I should be able to say worksheets dot delete. Oh, there's a delete. Okay, so worksheets dot delete. Do I have to give it an index number? Truth is, I'm not quite sure. Let's delete number 1 and see what happens. Oh, what happens if I try to delete the whole thing? Oh yeah, it's trying to clear out the whole thing. So there's no question on the test on this, but to answer the question, if you say some collection.delete, it's trying to clear out the whole collection. What I'm really interested is that you see how to put items into a collection, which is the add method of the collection, and how to delete items out of it, which is typically the delete method of an object in the collection. So in this case, it would be like worksheets, identify a particular one, and then delete that particular worksheet. This question over here on this.
I'm just sure when you say collections, that's like the debugging term for like an array.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about arrays starting on Wednesday, starting tomorrow. So it's a different thing than an array. An array is, let's not talk about what an array is, let's talk about what a collection is. A collection is an object. It's got methods and properties, so it is an object. But it's a special kind of object. We say, you know what, we have enough of these that behave just the same way in different contexts that we want to treat them all similarly, so we call them collections. And all the object has, it has reference to other objects. So this collection has a bunch of references to all the different objects that are in the worksheets. And so it's an object that has some properties and methods, but the key thing is that it's just holding references to other objects. It allows me to iterate across all the objects, all the worksheets, or all the workbooks in Excel. Okay. Other question? Go ahead.
So with that collection of worksheets 1, is that the only way to reference them, or can you do worksheets and then like the name of the?
Yeah. So the question is this the only way to refer to an element in the collection? And the answer is no. So here you can always refer to an element of a collection by its number. So it's got some number that says, I got 17 here. I can use some number to say which one I'm talking about. For some collections, if the objects have names, we can refer to the objects by their name as well. But not all collections are collections of objects with names. But if they have a name property in the collection, you can almost always just refer to it by its name. And so in this case, we have one called promos as a string. And I should be able to delete that. It's identified it, so I'm trying to delete it. I don't really want to delete it, so I'll cancel it. But the code has actually identified that sheet. Another question?
It's just to jump on this. We talked about like colors as a property. Is that a collection, or what was that when we would like use like an index for the colors and everything?
So the question is dealing with colors. Let's take a look at this. And the answer is no, they're not collections, but let's actually see it in the context. So let's just say active cell dot interior dot color. I'm going to use the color index. Color index. So color index is the property, and it can take an integer between like 0 and 51 or something. There's really not that many different color indices that we can use here. But I can say that equals, try 44. And that's color index number 44. And so it's not a collection, but it just happens to have, it's got these numbers, but I'm not using the numbers to identify an element in the collection. It's just, I'm putting the property 44 into the value 44 into the color index property, and that changes the way the cell is. That's what properties do. When I change the property, it changes something about the way that the object is. And this is a good example because I can see it. I can see it change. Question in the back? That color index is a property. Okay. Yeah, so the question is, wait a minute, this kind of feels like it's a method because it's doing something, and but it's not, it's a property. Let me make it clear the difference here. The difference is, this is the reference to the property, okay? And so kind of takes all of this to get down, so they got to find the right object and then get down to the right property. And if that were on a line by itself and it could execute, just the part I have highlighted, that would be an instruction, but here it's not. This is, it's like a variable. It's just holding a value. This is here is the instruction here. This is the assignment statement. It says, it's an instruction. It says, take whatever's on the right-hand side of me and put it into whatever's on the left-hand side. And so we can see here, this is just a receptacle for a value. In this case, it's holding, it's taking on this new value. And so that's why we can look at this and say, oh, that's a property rather than a method, because we're putting a value into it rather than just telling it to go and do something. Question here. Sure, an example of a method is going to be like select. Let's do this. Active cell dot, and the methods are the ones that look like they're little objects in actions, little squares in action. So activate is one, add comment is one. Auto fit is a good one. So let's do that. Let me go ahead and do active cell dot entire. You can't auto fit a cell, but you can auto fit a column. So let me go from active cell to entire column dot auto fit. Auto fit. We'll execute this, and that's now, I'm hit enter, and it's now an instruction. It by itself is an instruction. We should be able to see the active cell is here in C5. From there, we'll be referring to the entire column, so that should be a reference to column C. We'll auto fit column C, so it should shrink it down just to fit the data. So here we'll execute it. Now that is an instruction. We're telling it to go auto fit itself. It's an instruction. The important thing to realize here is that that is an instruction that is built into the object. It's part of the definition of the object. It's not part of VBA, where VBA knows how to auto fit stuff. VBA doesn't know anything about auto fit. VBA knows how to tell the range to auto fit itself. The range object has that knowledge, or that instruction has that method. Other questions here? Go ahead.
Sorry if you answered this, but to me, a collection seems like it's just essentially like a group of objects, right?
So the comment is a collection is like a group of objects. Technically, a collection is an object that holds references to other objects. So I think you got the right idea, but let me just say it precisely. An object that has references to other objects.
Okay. Because it seems like if you say like the sheet or something, object.
Active sheet is an object, yeah.
And then each range in it is like another object. And so it seems like the active sheet is a collection of all the possible ranges. Right?
Oh, okay.
Where does that get off?
Yeah, so the question here is, it seems like we've got a sheet here that is like this sheet holds all these different cells. So why isn't the sheet a collection? Yeah, and the answer is because a sheet has all kinds of different things. It's not just a collection of cells. So a sheet can have objects sitting on it that aren't in any cell. It actually has a property that is a collection of shapes that's in it. So it also has a property called cells, which is a collection of all the cells. So you might look at that sheet and think, well, it looks like it's a collection of those cells, but it has a property that is a collector, a holder for all of the cells that are in it. So for example, active sheet. Active, T-I-V-E, sheet dot cells. It's a collection. It's kind of a bad example, but I'm going to ask for the count of it. How many cells are there on a worksheet? 1.4 million times 64,000. I think that's a number that's bigger than Excel is going to be able, that VBA is going to be able to deal with. So we get an overflow. It's actually trying to figure out and tell me how many cells there are, but it's not capable of dealing with a number that big. So cells is the collection that you're thinking of when you say, oh, here's a worksheet that's holding all these cells. The worksheet must be a collection. No. The worksheet has a property called cells that is a collection of all the cells on the worksheet. But I think it definitely has a rows collection. And I should be able to ask for the count of the rows. So the worksheet itself has several properties that are themselves collections that are, collections that hold the references to these various objects. Okay. Next question. Go ahead.
The last command you have where it's active sheet dot range parentheses quote v5 quotation parentheses dot range.
Okay. Why don't you tell me which one is this? The line you're talking about?
No,
This one right here?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Glad you asked this one. You'll probably get the question right because there's a question on the exam right on this very specific one. Okay. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I've said too much already. Should go. Am I still recording? Oh yeah, good. So maybe we should go back and take that off the recording. All right, recording people, you're lucky. We're leaving it on for you too. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. So the reason that I want you to see this, the reason that I want you to be familiar with this particular syntax, is because this gets recorded. Let's go ahead and record ourselves doing a macro that would do something with it. So really quickly, I'm going to record. It's going to be called macro 2. That's a great name. I'm going to put myself onto relative references, developer, relative references. Okay, so my active cell right now is D13. I'm going to select one column over, starting in E13, and I'm going to select 3 cells. Okay, so this is recording something in relative, but in kind of one move, I am both offsetting and selecting. I'll stop recording. That's all I did. Stop recording. Let's go look at that line of code. So, view Project Explorer, Module 2. Okay. So this isn't exactly like what we see here, but let's talk through this, and then we'll extend it to the example that I have in the study guide. So here we're saying, listen, we've got an active cell. So that is a reference to a particular cell. Now, talk about this. What is offset? You can get one of two things here, and I would say either one you're fine with. So go ahead and say what it is. Oh, no, I thought I heard someone say it. Okay, it's a method. This is a method. Technically, it might be a method, it might be a property. Microsoft is kind of a little bit loose on this. It's either a method or a property, but the point is, it is a method or a property that returns a reference to what? This identifies a particular cell. Yeah, another cell. I could say object. This identifies another object. And so from here, we're calling a method that returns a reference to an object. It goes and finds a particular object. From there, we are doing what? So the question is, hey, isn't this an absolute reference? Now, okay, so let's go back. What cell did I select? I was on D13, and I selected E13 through E15. Okay, so from the active cell, D13, offset 0 rows. So I'm staying on the same row, and I'm offsetting 1 column. So that gets me to where? This part here gets me right to E13. One single cell, E13. But I didn't just do that. I selected multiple cells. And so we get the range method here. Oh, my heavens. But how does A1 to A3 get into this? How many of you are looking at this right now and going, that's really, really weird? Yeah, I'm looking at this. I know exactly what's happening here, and I still look at this and say, that's really, really weird. So because the macro recorder records it this way, I want you to understand what's going on. So before I explain this here, let's go back to the example from the study guide. Okay, so when I look at range, when I look at this range right here, I want you to tell me what kind of object is that a method of? Is it a workbook? Is it a shape? Is it a chart? What kind of object is range a method of? Remember, methods are built into the descriptions of objects. So a worksheet, yeah, it's a range of the worksheet object because it's dot range, and what kind of object comes before the dot? The worksheet. So this is a method of the worksheet class of objects. Now, look at this one. What class of object is this a method of? To answer that question, you say, what kind of object comes before the dot? What kind of object have we identified here? Let's back up. What kind of object does this identify? A worksheet. What kind of object does this identify? A cell, but we would say in VBA lingo, range. It's a range object. So this must be a method of what kind of object? Whoa, it's a method of a range object. This seems a little bit strange because it says range right here. It takes something in quotes. I got range right here, take something in quotes. It's totally different methods that it's referring to. This is a method that's defined. This is a method that's defined as a part of a worksheet. This is a method that's defined as a part of a range. And here's the difference. The range method for a worksheet is an absolute reference. And so when I give the reference to this method, to this range method, it goes, it's a reference from the worksheet, it's an absolute reference. But when I say I'm calling the range method of a range, it's not the worksheet that I'm operating on, it's the range. And so what it does is it says pretend, for just a moment, pretend that whatever range I'm referring to here is the upper left-hand corner of the worksheet. It's like a relative reference. It's like if this was the top left-hand corner of the worksheet, what reference would I be referring to here? So we'll come back here now and look at this. This referred to, in our example, this refers to cell E13. And if cell E13 were the upper left-hand corner of the worksheet, and I selected A1 to A3, what would that refer to? If that were the upper left-hand corner, and I said A1 to A3, that's what I have selected. We haven't done very much with this in class beyond just recording, like on the third day of class or so, we recorded something with relative references. I didn't even spend a whole lot of time talking about it. But that's kind of the weird thing here. And the reason that I want you to get this is because it points out really strongly that I could have two different methods with this exactly the same name that are doing totally different things because they belong to different kinds of objects. And so the cell reference for the range method of the range object is relative to the range. The cell reference in the range method of the worksheet object is relative to the worksheet, but that means it's an absolute reference. Whatever I have there, it's talking about that particular cell instead of being here as a relative. So let's just take kind of a bizarre example. So here's range B2. Now, this is a little bit strange because I have an implied object. What's the implied object here? Active sheet. I'll go ahead and put it in here. Okay, but it returns a reference to a range, and a range has a range method. So I can do that, which returns a reference to a range object. So it has a range method, which returns a reference to a range object, which returns a range object, has a range method. Dot select. What do you think? Tell me what cell it's going to be. Don't tell me exactly what cell it's going to be, but give me some, right? Yeah, somewhere. So A1, 8, yeah, it's going to go right along the diagonal, right? I don't know how many I did, but we'll find out. So we selected S, Q, R, S, E, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. We put 7 more on there, and it should be Z26. Seven more. Z26, hey! Yeah, it's weird, but the point is I want you to get this idea that I can have 2 different methods with exactly the same name as long as they belong to different objects, and they can do totally different things. In this case, it's the difference between an absolute and a relative reference. Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. It's good to have someone who's gone through the study guide. Very good. Other questions? Go ahead.
So when I was like looking at this question and I tried to find it on my own. So if you take that last bullet point, but by using a pair of cells, this one's the most similar to it because I feel like you can replace that cells 1, 1 with like range B5 or something. But then you could also do it like the example we just talked about, but it would give very different things. So in that last example, is the cell 1, 1, that is the object that comes before that is the active sheet range, and then the range E5, the object that comes before that is the same object. It's that same active sheet range. Is that the difference in those two?
The truth is, I lost you about a few words into that whole description. Let me talk about. I definitely want to make sure I talk about these, and let's see if it clears it up here. Okay, so active sheet range A1. Okay, so these are like different ways. So it turns out that the range method of a worksheet can take lots of different input into it. And so, here, this is the one we've used the most. Just refer to a particular cell. But what do you think this one does? Look at this one. What does this do? A1 colon B4 comma E1 to E5. This is valid syntax. It selects 2 contiguous ranges. So this gives me 2 separate contiguous ranges. So A1 to B4, and it also selects E1 to E5. Okay, so that's, but notice this is a single string argument, right? Inside of quotes, I've given it a string, and that method can look at that and go, yep, I got it. I know just what cells we're talking about. I can refer to that particular one, okay? And so now this one, so how about this one? What does it do? Selects everything between A1 and E5. So in this case, the big difference here is that up here, I've got 1 string argument. Here, I'm giving it 2 string arguments. So I'm saying select, on this sheet, range a particular starting cell and an ending cell. When I give 2 arguments, it's like a starting and an ending cell. And those can come in a couple of different ways. Let's take a look. So let's just say this. Range, and let's do just that same, what was it, A1, the first one, and then E5. Dot select. So if I execute that line, it selected A1 to E5. Believe me, that's what it did. Now in this case, I have passed it 2 string arguments, but these don't have to be strings. It could actually be an actual reference to a cell. So how do I reference a particular cell? Range B2. So that's a string argument to A1. Here is a range argument to B2. So now this says, I'm giving this to the range object of the active sheet, or the range method of the active sheet, and it goes, oh, you've given me a range as the first one. I know exactly what you're talking about, B2. Oh, you've given me a string here. Could that be a reference to a cell? Oh, yeah, I can figure that out too. And it's now going to give me one that starts at B2 and goes to E5. And so these arguments here can either be strings or they can be ranges. And it will kind of figure that out. And so one of the really powerful things here is to be able to say, I'm not sure exactly which range we're talking about, but through my code, I can figure out by kind of like doing and. Let's do an example with and here in just a second to be able to say I want to get the contiguous set of data here. So let's say that I want to select just this column as long as I have contiguous data, but I don't know. Beforehand, I don't know there's only 4 rows of data. There could be 4, but the user could add a bunch more, and I got to get the whole set. And this is one where we probably haven't spent as much time on class as to notice there's a few questions on the exam that kind of expect you to know the parts I'm about to review. We have talked about it in class, it's in the book, but let me just make sure you see it here. Okay, so if I wanted to select just this particular cell here, the last cell in my contiguous data from starting in B1, how would I do that just through VBA, through Excel? What keystroke gets me? Yeah, control down. So control down moves me to the end. And the way that I do that is starting in range B1, range B1 dot end, and then in parentheses, I give it one of these arguments, XL down. So notice XL down is not in quotes. It is just it's a constant. It's a predefined constant. It's actually a number. If we said print XL down, it would give us a number like 7 or something. And I'll select that. Kind of boring because it was already selected, but let me come up here to A1 and I'll say I'm selecting that particular cell. So far, so good? Now, what if I wanted to do the whole column though? If I wanted to refer to that whole entire column, what do I do? We have just gone over all the building blocks that we need to be able to answer that question, but we haven't put them together yet. Comment here in the back? Oh, okay. So just add dot entire column, dot select. Okay, so B1 is going to refer to that particular cell there. So B1 refers to that cell there. And then this whole thing refers to which cell? B5. And so from there, can we just say entire column? We can. It's valid syntax. Let's see what it does. And so, yeah, it does something, but that's not what I'm after. I want to select just the data that's based on a contiguous column. So just the data. So we've identified to a particular cell here, and then we've asked from that cell refer to the entire column, and it gives me the whole column. So that's not where we're headed. Range. Okay. What do I do? Then what do I put? Put all of this. Oh, do range B1, comma. Yeah, because range B1 refers to B1, and then this whole line here refers to whatever cell I would be thinking about if I was on B1 and hit control down. And so now I have 2 arguments. I'll just highlight one of them here. So I'm saying I want to refer to a range, a multi-cell contiguous range. I'm going to give it 2 cells, a starting cell and an ending cell. My starting cell is B1, comma, this starts at B1, that's easy. And then it ends on whatever I would be referring to if I was on B1 and hit control down. And now here, where do I put this dot select? Do I put it way out here, or do I put it in here on this? That's right. So I've identified the whole range here, and that's what I want to select. And that selects that particular range. So when you're kind of working with existing data, that little trick is really powerful. And so, but it's just kind of a composition of a couple of other simple ideas. Being able to say, I want to bounce to the end of my contiguous data, and this, is just, this is referring to a single cell. If I want a multiple cell contiguous range, I better say range, and then have 2 arguments built in. Does that answer the question that you had? Good. Question here.
Clarifying question. When you're using the resize object or the resize method of the range, you're resizing with range, not like the specific properties of the cell.
Okay, so the question is, when you're using the resize method of a range, now, do you mean autofit was the one we looked at before?
No,
you mean resize?
5.7.
Let's take a look real quick. 5.7. Understand the resize method of the range object. All right. So let's take a particular range. R-A-N-G-E. Range A1 dot resize. Row size, column size. Truth is, there's no question on resize. I don't even know what it does.
Looks like that's the absolute size of the.
See, the thing is, you can't resize a range. You resize a column. So it's gonna change it. So let's take a look. So let's go ahead and let's just see what it does. Row size, I don't know. I'm going to put in 3. Column size, I'm going to put in 5. There's no question on it. That's true. But since we are, here for the learning, okay, that refers. Let's try to select it. Yeah. So it says from this range, we're going to try to push it to 3 columns, 3 rows and 5 columns, which is what it did. Yeah, probably got to that part of the study guide and was tired of writing questions and went, whatever, let's move on. Okay, so what do you think? Object or method? Technically, it's a method that returns a reference to an object. It returns an object. So we're saying start on here, do something, and it figures out what we're talking about. It says, oh, we're talking about a different range, and then there it returns the reference to that range. Question here? So the question is right here. Holy cow, we saw one with using range twice. Range B1 and then range B1 dot and XL down. But how about this? What do you think? This is really just the same thing, right? We have range here. We got 2 arguments, and each one is a reference to a range object. So when we say cells 1, 1, what does that return a reference to? Range A1, yes, cell number A1. It's a different method to get to a reference to a range. So it doesn't have to be the word range. It has to refer to that particular, it has to refer to a range. So the question is, when it receives an object, it accepts it as 2 different, it doesn't really accept it 2 different string arguments. It says, oh, you've given me a reference to a range here. I know what to do when you give me a reference to a range. If I give it a string, it goes, oh, you've given me a string here. I know what to do when you give me a string. It actually behaves differently depending on what kind of value that you pass it. Yeah. Whew. Okay. Any more questions? Go ahead.
When you're defining a variable for a module level scope, I just saw an example of it, and it just had dim in the variable name, but it didn't have a variable type. Do we need to specify a variable type? Or this is 6.5. Yeah. Do we need to define a variable type, or do we just say dim and then the variable and begin the module? That's it.
Okay. Let me ease some of you here. I'm not going to be, there's no question on this on the test, but let me answer the question. Let me answer the question by saying there's no question on this on the test. We really haven't covered this in class yet. I have hopes that we'll cover it later. That we'll probably start covering it tomorrow, but there's no question. There's no question because the book talks about it, but we haven't covered it, and so I haven't put it on. There'll probably be a question on the final, but not on the midterm. Maybe you need to go back and review the midterm. Too late for you guys, but maybe next year. Go ahead. Are there other ones that aren't here that you really should know about? I'm not familiar enough with the connection between the study guide and the exam to be able to answer that, I'm afraid. So yeah, here's the point though, folks. And so the point here is that I've given you the study guide because I'm thinking this is the kind of things that I think are important. I want you to spend some time studying this. There's not a question for every concept in the study guide. This one probably should come off the study guide because we really haven't covered it yet. I used to cover this before the midterm, but now we don't. So I just haven't updated the study guide. But as we go through these, if I see any other ones that I go, oh, wait a minute, that's not what I'm expecting you to know, I'll point it out. Generally, anything on here is fair game, yeah. Okay, so I'm kind of planning to go until 7:30. So I'm glad to continue to take questions, but it might be helpful for at least kind of go through and make sure there's not many more of these that I go, oh, wait, that's more than I want you to know. Go ahead and take another, go ahead and take another question.
So my understanding of the difference between variables and constants is that variables can be updated at any time and constants don't change. Do I need to go more in depth with that?
Let me go ahead and repeat the question for the recording. So the question is, hey, difference between a constant and a variable. Let's just talk about it really quickly. So constants and variables are extraordinarily similar to each other. So someone just tell me what a variable is. Kind of two parts to what a variable is. Variable is a location in memory with a name. It's a named location in memory. A constant is a named location in memory. The only difference is that you set the value of a constant when you declare it, and it can never change. A variable, you can change its value over and over and over again. X equals 5, X equals 6, X equals 12. The constant, once you've set its value, it's constant, it doesn't change. So they're really, really similar to each other. The only difference is that once a constant has its value, it never changes. So the comment is technically a variable, if you had a variable that you set a value to and you never changed it, that probably should be a constant. And the answer is it should be a constant if when you set its value, you're actually just setting it with a value, not like asking the user for it. Because the constant has to get its value on the line that it's declared. And both variables and constants, they're actually set up in memory before any code starts running. And so what you can't do with a constant is you can't say, hey, how many employees are there in this company? And the person goes in 25 and you go, great, I'm not changing that. I'm saying that can't be a constant because it has to just get its number as a constant value. You'd have to say employee count, constant employee count equals 35. That would be okay. Yeah, but that's true. If you create a variable and you write a value into it, just like with a literal number, and you never change it, it probably should be a constant in your code. The only difference is dim versus const. Yeah, that's true. There's one kind of other small difference, and that is if you say dim, you can't declare variables in the immediate window, but let me just do it anyway as a place to type. If I say dim x, and that's the first question is that enough? Do I have to say as integer or anything here? No, I can leave it just like this. What type is it going to be if I just say dim x? It'll be variant. It's going to go, oh, you don't tell me what kind, it's got to be variant. When a constant, if you say const x, and then you have to give it a value, const x equals 5, that will not be a variant. Why not? Yeah, you gave it a value, and the interpreter's smart to look at that and go, we don't need a variant for that. The whole idea is variant. I don't know what you're going to do with it. The interpreter doesn't know what you're going to do. With a constant, it knows what you're going to do, and so it will pick an appropriate type. The truth is, it'll probably pick a long integer for this. It could get by with byte, but it doesn't pick that well. But it does pick one, and it's not going to. It won't be variant. It'll never be variant. Constants are never variant. Well, you can specify a type for constants as well, so I guess you could specify it as variant, but it wouldn't. The question is, you have to define a value to a constant as you declare it. You can't later come back and give it its value. If you're going to give it a value, it's got to be when you declare it. I think if you give it a type and you didn't give it a value, it might go, oh, I've got a default value for this type, I know the value without specifying it. But yeah, you always do give it a value.
This is a quick one, but when you're using unions, a union basically says this range and this range. And then we talked about specifying ranges before, and when we specify ranges the other way, basically it means like this
Yeah,
or this.
let me talk about union.
Okay.
That's a good one for us to take a look at. Okay, so let's take a look here at the worksheet, and let's look at these two different things. Let's look at A1 to C5. So range, I'm going to specify here, I'll do it with two other references to cells. So range A1, or let's see, what did I say? C5. And we'll start over here with cells 1, 1, and we'll select. So here, how many cells is this going to select? Is it going to be 2 or is it going to be more than 2? Yeah, it's that whole, it's a multi-cell contiguous range. One corner, the other corner, everything defined by those two corners. Now, there's another one called union. Right, let me just take this whole line. And I'm going to change range to union. It's kind of tough to tell here because I had a color on it. So let's change this to C4. Ooh, sounds explosive. So now the union says, listen, you've given me 2 ranges, and I just want to make those two independent range references into a single range. But it's not like taking everything between them. It's just saying, you've given me 2 ranges. I want the union of those 2 ranges. So in the same lingo of set theory, what union means, when you learned set theory in what, 3rd grade? Union means the same thing here that it did back then. I've got 2 sets. I'm unioning those 2 sets. It is just the set that has all of those elements in those sets. So this is important because this could be arranged at C4 to E4, colon E4. And so now I've got the union of those 2 sets. I have a set here with 1 cell in it. I've got a set here with 3 cells in it. And the union of those has 4 cells. Question? Okay, before we move on, I just want to make sure we answered the question here.
Yeah.
Okay, let me do one more thing here. Let's make this little plus here. So let's do like D1 to D10. So range R-A-N-G-E D1 colon D10. That'll give us a nice little cross there. But I just want to point out that in addition to union, there's also what? Intersect. And that will give you just where those 2 ranges intersect. Okay? All right.
Yeah, 7.7 is a program if not, and then not.
Something hideous.
I was hoping we could kind of work through that logically and make sure that
Okay, so the question, let's go ahead and, you know what? We got full code here, I bet. My guess is I actually wrote that in VBA and then copied and pasted it over here, so probably will execute. Oh, it already had a sub. Shoot. Okay. So we declared these variables, and the question is, how does all of this execute? So let's take a look. So as we're coming down here, we say, okay, this is going to be not. What does not do? Change a true to a false or a false to a true. And so I've got not, so that's going to reverse whatever this evaluates to. Okay, so this has an or here in the middle. So this looks like my easiest one here. So let's look at this. Is this part here true or false? Y greater than Z. Yeah, so let's see. This might be helpful for me to actually put a comment in here so I can see it while I'm looking. So in this case, this is going to be 50. And in this case, this is going to be 200. Okay. So now I've got 50 greater than 200. So this part is false, yeah? So let me just kind of put in here, just for my own sanity here, I'm going to put here false. That part's false. All right, now this part here is z is greater than x plus y. Z is 200, x plus y is 150. So this part here is true. So this part is true. Now, do I do the or first or do the not first? Yeah, the not's going to happen first. And what I meant to show you here is that, look, we've got the parentheses here, the not operating on the parentheses, but that's not especially clear here. So let's go through it this way. So then this whole thing here is going to be, yeah, that is not true, so that is false. And so now this whole thing is false or false up to doing this whole part here. False or false is well, if I'm using or, what does it take for or to be true? One of them has to be true. They could both be true, that's okay. But as long as one of them is true, the whole thing's going to be true. And so in this case, this is false. And so then the whole, so this whole thing is false. And so then the whole thing, because I've got one more not out here, the whole thing is going to be true. So this should put hello into range A1. I'm not going to give you anything nearly this complex. Okay, but hold on a second. So what I want you to make sure you understand is what does not do? Reverses a logical expression. And for and to evaluate to true, what? Both have to be true. For or to evaluate to true, just one of them has to be true. And so I'm not going to give you something this complex on the test, but it might be something with an and an or in it. But even though there's a specific order of operations, like which one happens first, the or, the and, if there's no parentheses in there, I'm not expecting you to know that. I will always give parentheses to show specifically which happens first. Okay. Who asked that question? Did you have more on it? Okay. Other questions? Okay, then let's just kind of go through quickly, and as we talk about these things, if you have any questions. So we were, yeah, so a few things here. Personal macro workbook, this workbook or new workbook, 3 places you can record a macro. And so the chapter talks about that. I think we've only ever recorded it into this workbook, but understand where these other ones are going to put it and why might you want to use one versus the other. Quickly, what's the thing? What's the big one here? Yeah. What's the whole point for the personal macro workbook? Whatever macro is in the personal macro workbook, it's just always available. Any macro is available as long as it's in an open workbook. It doesn't have to be in the workbook you want to run it on. As long as it's in an open workbook, you can execute that macro. The personal macro workbook, once you record a macro into it, it creates that workbook, and every time you open Excel on this computer from now until forever, it will automatically open the personal macro workbook and hide it. You can still go see it through your code editor and get to the code, but it's just a hidden workbook. Okay, what's the difference between XLSX, XLSM? That's right. How many macros are in XLSX workbook? None. Can you be positive of that? You can be positive of that. That's the whole point. Shortcut key, Alt F11, you should know that. Understand how to break one VBA statement into multiple lines. What's the character for that? Underscore lets you put one statement onto 2 lines. You want to put a single quote, does what? Yeah, everything ignores everything else that comes after that on the line. Okay. Understand what objects are, properties, methods. We've talked about this. How to read code and look at it. A simple line of code, what's happening if it's an object. And we've talked through that, so I think we're okay with that. With and end with. This is not a syntax I'm really thrilled about, but the macro recorder records it. So I want you to be familiar with it. Some test with range A1 and with. Okay, When I have a with, end with block, any statement or any expression that begins with a dot on the inside of this, dot value equals 12, dot font, dot bold equals true. So it's really, really simple. All it says is, listen, if I have any expression that begins with a dot, normally I can't start anything with a dot, right? I got to have some object, dot, and then do something. The with structure says, here's the object. And then anything between the with and the end with, if I have an expression that starts with a dot, just plop this object in front of it. That's all it does. Yeah, so the point, I don't have to say range A1, that, range A1, dot value, dot font, dot bold, range A1. I don't have to keep putting it. There are some other reasons that you would really want to do that. In other words, I might have a statement here that creates a reference, it creates an object. And it returns a reference to the object, and then I can do things with that without ever having actually anything that binds onto it. There are some reasons why you might want to do that, but I want you just to think of it as it's just shortcut notation. That you could be fine if you never knew about it, except the macro recorder records it that way. So I want you to make sure you understand. So we talked about collections by name, delete method. Yeah, it's really just understand you can add items into a collection and delete items out of the collection. Okay, chapter 4, difference between, okay, syntax error and a runtime error. We talked about this just yesterday. So this is the most recent stuff that we have on the exam. What's the big difference between a syntax error and a runtime error? That's right. A runtime error, syntactically, it's okay. The interpreter can look at that and say, I know exactly what you're talking about. I can figure out how to translate that into an instruction to tell the computer to do. But when the computer tries to do it, it fails. It's like trying to open a workbook that doesn't exist. I told it a name. That's great. Syntactically, that looks good. The interpreter couldn't possibly know if that file actually exists until it goes to execute it. If the file doesn't exist, you said open workbook 12. There's no workbook 12. That's going to be a runtime error. So you should probably also be able to say, you know, when does a syntax error happen? When do you get notified of a syntax error? Okay, so it might be that if you type the line of code and that line itself is internally inconsistent, you'll get the red line. But it could be that, you know, it's like it's like a block if with no end if. There's no line to paint red. So in that case, you won't see the red line. You won't get the message box saying there's an error here. So in that case, when will you see that? First of all, is that a syntax error? It's a syntax error. When will you see it? Okay, louder. Yeah, when you compile it. What does it mean when you compile it? It means when you try to run it. So when you try to run it, so you might be tricked into thinking on question number 12 on the exam that that's a runtime error because you don't know about it until it runs, right? But it never runs. It fails when it compiles. It's starting to run, for example. We've got this with range A1. Syntactically, we're okay. And let me just say if true, then okay. So I have a block if with no end if. So there's no red line here. Is there a syntax error? Syntax error. If I got an if, I got to have an end if, unless I have a statement on the same line, which I don't here. So I go to run this, and now I see this error. But where's the way? The error is somewhere between the if and this end sub here. The error is somewhere in there. But here's the whole question. So the error is down here somewhere. Did this block of code execute? That's the question. Did this block of code execute? And the answer is no. Because it says compile error here. We're trying to compile this so we can run it, and it says I can't even figure out what this thing does. It never successfully compiled the subprocedure, and so even though I went to run this, that's when I found out that there was an error here. It's not a runtime error because none of this code is executed. But what if you know whatever error happens here, if this does execute, and here's where the error is, then what kind of error would this have to be? It's a runtime error. Yeah, it means it compiled okay. It started to execute. It actually started to run, and then it had an error. That's a runtime error. So that sequence is going to be important to understand. Question here? Okay, so good question. So when you get a runtime error, it will always runtime. Well, sometimes the environment freaks out a little bit, but 99.99, you got 5 nines. But when you have a runtime error, it's going to highlight in yellow the line. It says, I tried to run this line and I couldn't do it. That's right, runtime error. You'll never get a yellow line on a compile error because it hasn't started to run. The yellow line says, this is the line that I'm ready to execute. And with a compile time, with a syntax error, it never successfully compiles, and so it never starts to run anything. Okay. How to refer to objects in the following ways. We talked about these. How to refer to a single cell by specifying 2 integers. So make sure you understand how to use cells. This is, by the way, which cell is this? Is this D2 or is it B4? Yeah, anytime it's B4. So anytime you have an ordered pair, it's always row, column, RC. So it's row number 4, column number 2, so B4. Understand how to refer to, oh yeah, so cells 4, column B, this is B4 as well. So cells can take, for the second argument, can take either an integer or it can take a string, as long as the string is identifying the way we think of columns, like AB or whatever vowel column identifier is. Offset to refer to a range or cell, we talked about that. Understand all 7 approaches to identifying ranges listed in the section. I don't even know what 5.6 talks about. Anyone look at those and know what they are? Okay, so yeah, there's a few in there. Just be sure that you could identify those and go. You don't ever have to execute code. You don't ever have to come up with code here. So you're really being able to identify it. If you see that code, anything that I've done, I would expect you to go, oh yeah, I get that. I see what that's doing. Entire column, cell entire column, I got it. Resize, I think let the cat out of the bag because I didn't know how to do resize. So there's no question on the test on that one. Union. The truth is, I don't remember if there's a question on union or not. There has been in the past. Whether it's still there or not, I'm not sure. So data types. So yeah, I'm not expecting you to know crazy amount about data types beyond what we have here. So what's the approximate numeric range for byte? Yeah, 0 to 255. I'm not expecting you to know that specifically, but I'm going to give you something. The question on this is going to be like this. Suppose you had to store a value that could be an integer value anywhere between 10 and 20. What's the best data type for that? What would you choose? You go byte, yeah. Am I going to give you something like between 100 and 156? Would I do something like that to you? See, do you really know where the boundary is? No. They're going to be kind of in the meaty sections of these. But for integer, what is it? Plus or minus 32,000. And then long plus 2 billion. So I'm expecting you to know those ranges and those types. Questions? So the question is, you can't have a negative number as a byte, and that is absolutely correct. If you try to put -1 into a byte, it'll just say overflow. I can't fit this in here. Yep. Okay, be able to identify valid and invalid variable names, similar to those listed in the section. So variable name, I'm not sure what the section talks about, but the rules for variable name are what? Has to start with a letter, can be any combination of letters, numbers, and the underscore. Yeah, so that's what you're after there. So you should be able to kind of look at a variable that starts with a 4 or starts with a 3, and sure. So yeah, to be a valid variable name, got to start with a letter. So if I'm going to have a variable named 3 little pigs, it's got to be THREE. It can't be the numeral 3 little pigs because it's got to start with a letter. Can be any combinations of letters, numbers, and the underscore character. So can you have a space in a variable name? No. Can you have a dot in a variable name? Can you have a, you see why, don't you? Because dot means something. Could you have a plus in a variable name? No. Could you have you can have an underscore. That's a little unfortunate because we use underscore for line continuation as well. But technically, that line continuation character has to have a space before it. It can have a space in the variable name. So it can tell you're not trying to continue a line in the middle of a variable name. Okay, also understand option explicit. What does option explicit do? Yeah, it says if you're going to use a variable, you have to declare it. It's really protection against misspelling a variable name. You're going to use a variable, you have to tell me what it's going to be up at the top, and then you can use it. And then if not, if you use a variable name you haven't declared, it won't compile. It's actually a compiler directive. You're telling the compiler how to behave. You're saying don't just make up variables. I'm giving you a variable name, and you got to tell it, force me to declare the variable. Declare a constant, how a constant differs from a variable. We talked about that. Understand the difference between procedure level scope. This one is not on the exam, so you're okay there. Okay, so what's an expression? So an expression is not really like an equals. Yeah, the whole key on an expression is that it gets down to a single value. So I can have, anything I want here. If I'm saying print, 5, is 5 an expression? Yeah, it's an expression, single value. 5 plus 4, is that an expression? Yeah, 5 plus 4 concatenated with lives. Is that an expression? Yeah, it's kind of a weird expression. It says 9 lives, but it says the 5, oh, plus 4, that's 9. Oh, 9 concatenated with this string. You must need to change that number into a string and concatenate it, and it can still figure that out. It gets down to a single expression. So how about this? What if I have a call to a function in here? The left 3 characters of this expression? Yeah, because it's this whole thing evaluates all this VBA code I've written here evaluates to a single value. How about this? Can an expression be a statement? And the answer is no, because a value is not an instruction. I can say, x equals an expression. That would be a valid statement, an instruction to do. But an expression doesn't raise to the level of a whole instruction by itself. An expression is just a value. Difference between, what's the difference between these two expressions? 128 plus 256 strings and 128 plus 256. Go ahead. Right. So the point is that when you have quotes, when you use the plus operator between 2 strings, it says, oh, I mean concatenation. But if you use it between 2 integers, it says, oh, you mean addition. So that plus sign behaves differently depending on the context that it's used in. What if you have one as a string and one as an integer? I think it's going to actually convert the string into a number, if it can. So what is 3 plus 3? Yeah, 6. It prefers to do addition if it can. And so it looks at that string and goes, oh, yeah, that string is just a number in disguise. And it converts it into a number. Yeah, if it's 2 strings, this is going to be 33. Ooh. So yeah, that's kind of a thing that you could find yourself in. You could accidentally code yourself into a real problem if that's not something that you've learned. Is why I'm asking you to study that. The assignment operator takes whatever's on the right, plugs into what's on the left. Be familiar with the arithmetic operators listed in the section. What are they? Presumably it's addition, multiplication, division, subtraction, maybe modulus, integer division. These are all things I talked about in class. What's the likelihood of me picking one of these operators we've never talked about and giving you on the test? Extraordinarily slim. I mean, like very nicely approximated by 0. So are there anything else besides the ones I just listed in that section? There might be something like exponentiation, but there's nothing on exponentiation. The 6 comparisons is and like won't be on the test. So what is that like? Equal to, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, I don't know whatever else is there. Is really powerful when you're dealing with objects, but we haven't covered it. Like is nice. It's kind of like partial matching, but again, we haven't covered it, so we won't be on the test.
Like, is that, I mean, we're not testing on it, does that work the same way as a like would in SQL?
So the question is it just like in SQL? And the answer is no, but it's wildcards. So it's similar, but it's not the same logic as SQL like, but same idea. Logical operators versed 7.2 and or not. Okay, so we talked about this whole example. Understand how to call a function. When you need to use parentheses when calling a function and when you don't. Understand the difference between specifying the arguments for function arguments as named arguments. See, arguments for a function using argument list or named arguments. Do you want to take a minute on this? Okay, so I could say message box. I want to print MSGBOX. MSGBOX. Okay, now it has something here called prompt. So one option is just to put the values in the order that they're specified here. Let's do input box instead. Input box makes a little more sense. Input box. Okay, so prompt and a default value. I'm going to skip the title. I don't care what the title is, but I want to give a prompt here. So enter your name, and then I'm going to skip the title, and I'll put a default. I'll put my own name in here. And so now that will come up with enter your name and Alan as the default that I've plugged in here. You know, and if it's just one that I'm skipping here, this is a reasonable thing to do. But sometimes you've got like 5 things you want to skip. Just take the defaults for all those 5 and then put a value. In that case, you can say, listen, it doesn't really matter the order that I put these in. Let me even change the order. So when I'm just putting the values, order is important. But I can come in here and say default colon equals, F-A-U-T, colon equals Alan, comma, prompt, colon equals, enter your name. And so if I decide, you know what, I don't care about the order, I just want to actually say what the names of the parameters are and give them their values, then that's the syntax. That should behave exactly the same. So it still brings up and it still knows Alan. Even though I put Alan first, it knows, oh, that's the default. That's the value that goes into default. This is the value that goes into prompt. And so that's the difference there. Questions on using named references versus just a value list? So the syntax seems weird, colon equals, because it's not really an assignment. It's just naming the parameter. So that's the syntax. Go ahead. Yeah, so, and this is just a rule that you should probably just memorize. When do you need to use parentheses on calling this function? And the answer is when I'm doing something with the value it returns. So I've got the parentheses on here. What am I doing with the value that this returns? What am I doing with it? This value is going to return whatever the user types in. What am I doing with the value that gets returned? I'm doing something with it. Oh, I am. What am I doing? I'm printing it. Yeah, I'm printing it. What if I take the print off so I'm not doing anything with it? It's going to say parentheses don't belong there. It doesn't say it that way. I expected an equal sign here somewhere. I expected to assign the results of this to some variable or something. And so in this case, because I'm not doing anything with the return value, what should I do? Just get rid of those parentheses. The good folks at Microsoft have repented of this decision that they made here. Now, in the current versions of Visual Basic, they say put the parentheses all the time. It'll make your life so much easier. But it was the 90s. It was a strange time. And so this seems like a strange thing to do, because why am I even doing this if I don't care about the return value? And the answer is, I just wanted to make the user feel good by letting them type something in. I'm not doing anything with it, but I wanted to show this part. I want them to think I'm paying attention to them. You know, enter, this could be, you know, evaluate your professor or something. We don't really care, but, you know, tell us what it is. So, yeah, and that's, at this point, maybe just remember, commit that to memory. If you're doing something with a return value, you've got to put parentheses around the argument list. Okay. How are we doing on this list? 9, trim. Well, we talked about all these already, so you don't have to come up with these from scratch. You don't have to be able to look at some and say, which one of these is right? I'm going to give you code that's executable code, and you're going to look at it and say, I understand what it does. Okay, so it's not like, here's left with a string first and the number second. Here's with those reversed. You don't have to go there. 11, differences between function procedure and sub-procedure. What's the difference between a sub-procedure and a function procedure? First of all, are they largely similar or are they really, really different? They're really, really similar. They're both names block to VBA code that does something. The only difference is function procedure. Oh, okay, so you're saying it's got to take input. Function procedures and sub-procedures both either can but don't have to take input. So that, whether it takes a value or not, is not a differentiator between sub-procedure and function procedure. Function procedure returns a value. That's it. So if I want this procedure to do something and send the value back to where it was called, I don't start with sub, I start with function. That's the difference. And it really is the only difference. Really, that's the only difference. Okay. 13, understand the single line if. Yeah, so various kind of conditional branching code, single line if, then, else if, and then have, or if, then, else, and if, and then be able to throw a bunch of else ifs in there. And we talked about that one already too. How to exit procedures, functions, entire programs using exit and end. What does end do, by the way? End does not just end a sub or function. You have end sub, that just says the end of my block. But there's a statement by itself, just end. What does end do? You can put it anywhere in the code. End, it just kills the VBA. You're right, it doesn't matter how many, like you have a function that calls a function that calls a function, you hit an end and it's done. It just dies. What does exit do? It says, yeah, you know what? There's a bunch of lines down here I don't care about anymore because of whatever happened here, so just take me right out of this sub-procedure. But if I was called from something else, then continue on from where I was in this stuff. Okay. 14, are we almost, oh yeah, we're almost done, good. For next loops, including the step keyword, what does step do? Let's talk about for next loops. We've got for, x equals 1 to 10. We get down to next, so it says at the end of the loop. What does the next do? It does two things. Next does what? It increments, it adds 1 onto it, and then sends it back to the top of the loop. It adds 1 unless what? What else might it add? It might add a different number if you've included step. So we don't have time to cover that anymore today, but just make sure you understand what step does. Understand the for each loop, which we've done a bunch of times. Oh no, sorry, I haven't. We've done the do loop a bunch of times. For each loop, we've done a couple of examples, but the book covers this pretty well. Understand both until and while, good. Understand how to exit loops early with exits, the same, it's just a different structure. Be able to read and understand nested loops. So a loop inside of a loop. We talked about the worksheets collection by name or by number. Range, we talked about this, be familiar with end. So good, we've got that here. Answers to other questions. Okay, so yeah, there were a couple things that we identified on there where I said there's no question on that, but the rest of these, there's, for the vast majority of the rest of these, there's a question on the test on it. Maybe 1 or 2 where I just didn't quite get to it, but there we go. Other questions? All right, folks.
50 questions.
Total of 50 questions, no time limit.
6 of them are great.
Like the last several are not graded, and it might be like more like 8 or so, but yeah, so it's not really fully 60 questions. And the average time to do it really is less than an hour. I think it ends up being between 30 and 40 minutes. All right, class dismissed.